quickly. I think the most important thing to say first is that I'm actually the former head of growth at Instagram. I left that role about a month ago, and so we've got another person coming in, a woman named Carolyn Gaffney from LinkedIn, so really excited about that. I actually moved back over to Facebook, sort of extending my 7-year tenure there now. But happy to share sort of at least some of the thoughts during my time there. I was there for a little over 2 years, which ended up being roughly the time of 250 million to a little over 500 million in that sort of window of time. Cool, so let's get started. You're gonna hear a ton of really great tactical stuff today, and I figured I'd just sort of start with how I thought about growth joining Instagram. Facebook obviously has a really amazing reputation for growth. Instagram has a slightly different one. And it sort of started maybe oddly like this, which is about a year and a half ago or two, when I was new to the Instagram growth team, we decided to go visit a company in the Bay Area that we thought was interesting. For those of you who know Heath Ceramics, it's in Sausalito. It's a company that was started decades ago and then was bought by Catherine Bailey and Robin Petrovic in 2003 when they had 24 employees and $1 million of revenue. They're not public, but most recently they're probably close to about 20 million in revenue and 174 employees locally. So really sort of an amazing growth story. But what you don't know about this is that when they started, all of these amazing sort of pottery that they were selling most of it through wholesalers, which was two things to them. One was it was lower margin because they had to have another person in the middle. And the other thing was that they actually were disintermediated with a lot of their customers. So they didn't have a chance to sort of show people what they actually wanted them to see. And so as part of this process, they basically cut off about a third of their sales when Robin and Catherine joined and started from scratch. And started from scratch with this idea that they wanted to create very, very important principles for how they wanted to grow the company, even if it meant stopping growth and then going forward. This resulted in a little bit of an awkward conversation because when we arrived, I asked Robin, I said, well, great, thank you for having us. Tell us about your story. And his first question was, who are you guys again? And I said, okay, well, we're the Instagram growth team. And he's like, okay, well, I guess my first question is, why do you want to grow? So I was like, oh my gosh, my entire team's looking at me like, why do we want to grow? Money, a bigger community? And so it sort of triggered in my head, there's an important sort of thought process that you need to have around what you think you're trying to get to. All of the tactics in the world and all of the charts that go up and to the right will tell you a bunch of different things, but at the end of the day, it's really important to have an opinion about where you're going. And so that was sort of an initial construct I had as I was thinking about Instagram growth. The second one was sort of me just sort of dribbling around on the web and finding this artist who I really like. He's an artist out of Atlanta who now lives in Brooklyn. He effectively does art that is like the old motivational posters. And so I was on his website, and he had this, which I really liked, except I didn't understand. Growth is optional. Well, it doesn't feel optional. If Dave McClure was sitting here, I don't know where he is, but he would probably say growth is fucking not optional, right? And that's true. It felt mandatory. I don't understand. Why is this true? And so, I typed this into the browser, and what came up was this guy, John Maxwell, who ends up being a pretty big sort of leadership guru, I guess, amongst Fortune 500 companies. And one of the things that he says is, change is inevitable, growth is optional. And in that context, it sort of changes the view a little bit, which is to say that it's not that growth is optional, it's that it's intentional, and it's a choice. And sometimes you shouldn't be growing, like what Robin and Catherine did for Heath when they first started. But when you're in, you really need to be all in. And so what does that mean? So, well, the double click down for this is that he's got this set of constructs. I thought it was good enough to use as a mechanism for effectively sharing a handful of things that we did at Instagram. That may or may not actually apply to you, but certainly were some of the things that were useful for us as we went through a 2.5 year run of growing pretty nicely. And that the laws of growth sort of centered around these three areas, which is you had to be intentional about it, You had to have broad awareness for what you were trying to do and who you were as a company. And 3 is that you had to have consistency in the process. This wasn't like signing up for the gym in January and then all of a sudden not going to the gym January 10th, right? This was about actually like putting in the time, being disciplined, and moving forward step after step. So let's talk a little bit about this. So the law of intentionality says growth doesn't happen on its own. Makes sense. Sometimes it feels like it does, but it is actually happening because something is underlying there. You may not know what's happening, but it doesn't happen unless you actually try for the most part. And so when I think about like how that worked at Instagram, one is don't grow until you have product market fit. I had that when I joined, so I'm lucky. So sort of obligatory, don't pour water into a leaky bucket. Don't overflow. These are the things that you guys already know, although I will tell you, this reminded me of a funny story. Dave McClure and I started a T-shirt business while we were at PayPal together because Arnold Schwarzenegger was running for mayor of this state. And we had T-shirts that said, "Vote for me if you want to live." We sold 50,000 T-shirts in the first day, and then we realized, holy shit, we don't know how to make T-shirts. So, like, important, right? Like, the second thing is, and this is probably going to be the most photographed slide for everyone here, is I do think the head of growth should report to the CEO. So if you guys get promoted, congratulations. You can thank me later. Facebook obviously has been a pioneer in this construct. The head of growth reports to Mark. I reported to Kevin. I just think that at the high level, when you're intentional about trying to grow, it's actually really important that it's a first order thing. It's one of the most important metrics that you keep at the company, and that you've got someone who's focused on it 100% of the time. And then lastly, it is important to set a goal, but I actually think that it sort of doesn't give growth enough credit for being an empathetic function. So let's look at this, which is there's actually one audience that growth doesn't care about. That's the person who comes to Instagram every day and posts photos and likes your photos. That person's great. I don't care about that person. They're awesome. The 4 groups of people that I actually care about are these people. The people who have never used your product. Why? They don't know about Instagram, or they don't think Instagram's valuable, or they don't have a smartphone, or they're in a part of the country or a part of the world where Instagram isn't available. There's 100 different cuts for how this works, but this is one of the groups that I care about. The second group that I care about is you're new to the product. Everyone here knows that retention curves are really, really critical. You've probably got less than 7 days, but let's just say on a broader scheme, if you're looking at monthly actives, 28 days to convince someone to stay. And if you can actually keep at least one of those 2 people, you're doing freaking really well. That's how hard this game is. But it's really important to understand that once they register, you need to do whatever you can to understand their circumstance so that you can get them to this place where they understand how to use your product. The third group I care about, they use your product, but not really. There's a bunch of people who show up to Instagram once a month, twice a month. They're reacting to a notification or an email that we sent. They're not really users, and they're effectively going to leave us anyways. And so if this is the case and you can identify them, then you should do something about it, right? You should change their experience such that you can educate them how to be the user you want them to be instead of letting them churn, because that's what's going to happen to them. And that's a really important group, because at any given point in time, at least for Instagram, that's a few percentage points of the entire population. And getting them to stick around, getting them to understand why the product is valuable for them, being more aggressive with them than the actual users who are using you every day is something that you should do to try and keep them around. Because the last bucket is super hard. These are the people that have left you because they decided at some point in time that your product wasn't valuable. And getting them back is like really, really difficult. The other thing about resurrected users that you should all know, and we all do this all the time, is we do this thing where it's like, hey, come back to the app because it's awesome, and they come back to the same app that they hated and leave again, right? You've got probably a retention curve for resurrected users that looks more like 28 seconds. use it. Treat them differently. Tell them why the product's different. Tell them why the content's different. Tell them why you've done something that makes them want to stick around. Don't just bring them back and show them the same crappy thing that they left before. You're going to lose them again, and you will never get them back. If you do right by those 4 groups, MAU, all these things will move up in the right direction, but I think it's a more empathetic view of what the world looks like. The second law is the law of awareness. So you should know something about yourself before you grow yourself. There's a handful of things here. Countermetrics do count, and they can be painful. So as an example, growth team has sort of like a semi-nemesis in the protect and care team at Instagram. The protect and care team wants to make sure all the bad guys don't get into Instagram. And if that means a couple of good guys don't get in, fine. The growth team obviously wants all the good guys to get in and wants to make sure that, they get in and maybe a couple bad guys get in, and that's fine. But really understanding that if you're actually opening up this giant channel of growth and finding out later that it's not real, or you haven't figured out whether or not there's a countermetric that balances this, then you're going to put yourself in a whole different world of trouble. Other examples of this are notifications. You ask for notifications, and then people decline. The decline rate on notifications is actually a huge deal because the difficulty in getting that back is really, really hard. And if you aren't tracking that in some way, then you're putting yourself in a position where you are effectively going to find out that your entire user base does not have that permission for you, and you will not be able to notify them. The second thing is to fix forward. We see this behavior a lot, which is growth people are the grouchy people who are like, oh, you're changing the product again, damn it, like you're going to mess up growth. The reality is that the most important thing that a product can do is probably evolve, and that's actually good for growth. I remember having this discussion with a lot of the product leaders at Instagram. It was like, look, the most important thing that can happen right now is that Instagram changes in some material way, whether it's actually the logo, or whether it's actually the branding, or whether it's the implementation of stories. The growth team can figure out how to optimize on top of that, but you cannot be afraid of the main product actually evolving. If the main product were never to evolve again, growth will stop at some point in time. And so that's actually really key to have an attitude about that, which is every time there's product evolution, fix forward. It may hurt metrics in the short term, but find a way to live in the new world and find a way to optimize for that, because the product evolutions are really critical. And then the last piece here is to be quantitative and qualitative. And that doesn't mean having like a giant research team that you scour the world with. It just means talking to a handful of people. And you don't need to talk to that many people to figure out what's going on. So let's play a game, because these are some of the things that we figured out when we went and talked to some people. So first, which country has the lowest number of faces per photo? Guesses? No. Japan. Japan, why? People hate selfies in Japan because we also don't have filters that make people sort of like beautiful and cleaner skin. But also it turns out in Japan that privacy is so intense that if I take a photo of you and you happen to be in it, and I saw this, you go over to the person and say, hey, is it okay if I post this photo because like you're in it, I'm sorry. Turns out the conversion rate for that's pretty low. But that's not something you would necessarily understand unless you went and talked to someone. Second one, who's the most followed person on Instagram? Selena Gomez. Over 100 million followers on a base of over 500 million users. That's ridiculous. That in itself is not actually the point. The point is when you go to India and you look at all of the accounts that Indian people follow, where do you think Selena Gomez is in the list? She's not. People in India don't follow Selena Gomez, even though we show Selena Gomez an option to follow. Like, what the hell, right? Everyone wants to follow Selena Gomez. No, they don't. And actually what it tells you is that locally, local understanding of what people want to follow is actually really, really important, and you can't just assume that some of the top-level followers are going to work for everyone in the world. Which major country has more Instagram users than Facebook users?